Now we know how to track and aggregate events. In this video, we will learn how to make real-time data-driven decisions and act on it instantly with Datablit. Let's understand this by executing a business strategy for a flight booking website where flight prices dynamically change based on demand, supply, and user behavior. Suppose the company wants to update flight prices in real time considering the demand for the flight and the user interest level. The rules are simple. The company decided to increase the flight price by 30% if the flight booking rate in the last 1 hour is more than 20% and the user session count is more than 2 in the last 6 hours. Decrease the price by 10% if booking rate is less than 20% or user session count does not meet the criteria. This means a user visiting for the very first time will see the base price of the flight, and we will display dynamic flight prices only when the user session is more than 2 in the last 6 hours. The booking rate helps in predicting demand for the flights and is calculated as the number of times a flight is booked divided by the number of times a flight is clicked. User session count tells us how many times a user has visited the website, helping us to identify high intent users. If a user is very interested and there is a high demand for that specific flight, this means we can increase the flight price for that specific user as the chances of booking will be high. To execute this, first we need to track event. Whenever a user confirms a booking, we will call handle booking function. Inside this function, right after setting booking status to true, we will be calling datablit.track to track customer data, which takes an event name and event properties. Let's give event a name, flight booking. And the properties we want to track for this use case would be booking ID, flight ID, booking amount. Here, we have successfully captured which flight was booked, how much was paid, and the booking reference details. Now, we will track whenever a user clicks a flight to measure the interest for each flight. For this, we will again go inside our code base. Here, right after setting the selected flight, we will call datablit track with the event name as flight clicked. And the properties we want to track would be flight ID to know which flights is exactly selected by the user. Signals allows us to aggregate event metrics in real time. Let's create signal for this use case. To calculate the booking rate, we need to count the number of flights booked and the flights selected in the last 1 hour. To count the number of times a flight is booked in the last 1 hour, we will start by creating a new signal. Click create signal and set the key to flight booked. Since we are aggregating flight data, entity ID field would be flight ID. This is the grouping key used to aggregate event. The signal updates the value for each flight, helping us identify which flight are being booked the most. Next, set the aggregation window to 1 hour. Choose count as aggregation type. We want to count only the flight booking events. So in the filter expression, enter event is equal to flight booking. Hit submit to start computing the signal. Here, we are already logged in as a Arjun Patel. Right click the flight booking website to select inspect. Open the network tab. Select any flight to book. Here in the properties section, you can see the flight ID is flight 002. Now hit confirm booking. To check total bookings for any flight in the last 1 hour, click the 3 dots of the flight booked signal. Select evaluate. Here flight ID would be flight 002. Hit evaluate. You can see the result as flight booked is equal to 1. Book the same flight again. Hit evaluate again. Result has updated to 2. Now let's log in for another user, Garima. Book the same flight again, evaluate the signal flight book. Now the value has been updated to 3 as you can see here. Now we need to calculate the number of times a flight is clicked in the last 1 hour. The signal flight clicked will help us to understand how interested the users are for booking that particular flight. Click create signal, set the key to flight clicked. Since we are aggregating flight data, entity ID field would be flight data. Here the aggregation window and type would be the same, 1 hour and count. Since we are counting only the flights clicked event, the filter expression would be event is equal to flight clicked. Hit submit to start computing the signal. Now our signal automatically tracks every flight click over the past 1 hour. Here you can see I have already logged in as Garima Srivastava. Let's click the flight, copy the flight ID from the properties of the network section. The flight ID here is flight 003. Tap the three dots of the flight clicked signal. Choose evaluate to check the click count for that specific flight. Type in the flight ID, hit evaluate. You can instantly get the total clicks for that flight in real time. Right now it's 1. Now click again that specific flight for 2 times and hit evaluate. You can see the flight clicked has updated to 3. To calculate the number of times a user is visiting your website, we will create a new signal by clicking the same Click Create Signal button and set the key to session count. Since we are aggregating user data, the entity ID field would be user data. This is the grouping key used to aggregate events. As we have already discussed, describe the signal as count the number of users visiting the website. Next, set the aggregation window to 6 hours. And because we are counting widgets for the user, the aggregation type would be count. Next, for our filter expression, we will be counting the number of times a user is visiting our website. For this, we need to track whenever a user visits our homepage for booking. Add datablit.track with the event name homepage visited to track flight booking page for each user. That's it. Now we are able to track user session for the home page. We can update the filter expression of the session count signal, and that would be event is equal to home page visited. Hit submit to start computing the signal. The signal will now keep tracking the user sessions in the last 6 hours. Now let's log in as Arjun Patel Singh. You can see the event home page visited has been updated to this profile. Click to see event properties in detail. Here you can see the Datablit by default collect various properties of events like anonymous ID and assign it to the specific user ID, which is the user ID of Arjun Patel Singh in our case. The event type would be track and identify, message ID and the timestamp, event name, device ID and so on. Let's click a flight. Click the user profile tab again in the Datablit console. Here you can see the event flight clicked has been recorded. Click to view the properties of the event flight clicked. Now click the filter icon at the top. You can see the list of properties that we are tracking and the default properties. For better analysis, you can select all or one or the one you want to see in detail. Let's filter the properties we want to see in detail for this specific use case. Now let's book the flight that we selected earlier. Open the user profile of Arjun Patel Singh. Here you can see the event flight booking has been updated. Click to view the properties that we want to analyze in detail. Here you can see the booking details, booking amount and more. Now that we are able to track events and aggregate event metric in real time, the next step would be deciding the next course of action with Datablit rule. It takes signals and logical expressions to evaluate at runtime. Rules return a promise to evaluate the logic and return true if it satisfies the logic, else return false. Datablit.rule.evaluate function takes a key, which is a unique identifier, entity ID, and the parameter for rule evaluation. It returns a promise to resolve with a Boolean result. So to execute the problem statement, we have already created 3 signals with 2 different entity fields. But Datablit rule can evaluate only one entity ID at a time. So we need to create 2 separate rules. One to check if the flight booking rate is greater than 0.2 in the last 1 hour and another to verify if the user session is more than 2 in the last 6. Click create rule, set the key to booking rate. Here the entity ID would be flight ID as discussed earlier. Add a short description to define booking rate, which is the number of flights booked divided by the number of flights clicked. The booking rate helps in identifying the flights which are in high demand. In this case, we need to identify if the flight booking rate is greater than 20% to consider that flight is in demand. Copy the signal key aggregating flight booked, flight clicked event. The filter expression would be signal flight booked divided by the signal flight clicked should be greater than 0.2, which is 20%. Hit submit. You have successfully created your first. Let's create a session rule to evaluate if the user has visited flight booking website for more than 2 times. Let's set the key to session rule here. In this case, the entity ID would be user ID. We have already discussed that entity ID part earlier, so I am skipping here and give it a short description. Copy the key of the signal session count and paste it inside the expression signal session count greater than 2. Now that our rule is ready, let's integrate it in our code base. First, we will create 2 use states to update the rule result and take action accordingly. The first state to evaluate session rule with the name is session count. Initially, the rule result would be false and it updates to true when the rule satisfies the rule logic. Similarly, create another signal to evaluate the booking rate and it updates only when it satisfies the rule logic. Now let's create a callback function get adjusted price to update the price based on rule evaluation. Inside it, if is session count and booking rate both are true, we will increase the base price by 30%. If is session count is true but booking rate is false, in this case, we will decrease the price by 10%. If either one of them is false, we will decrease the flight price by 10%. Else, so the base price. If a flight is selected, adjust the price using session count and booking rate. No flight selected, price stays 0. Next, inside the use effect, we will evaluate our first rule. To evaluate the rule, we will call datablit.rule.eval rule. It takes the rule key and the parameter. Let's evaluate session rule first. Call datablit.rule.eval rule. The rule key would be session rule and takes the current user ID as parameters as we are evaluating the rule for the current user visiting the website. Let's call the API. And if the rule evaluation results true, it automatically updates its session count state to true. We will call only when there is a current user, so the dependency would be current user here. We will create another use effect to evaluate the booking rate rule. This one uses the rule key booking rate and takes selected flight ID as parameter. Let's call this. When the rule evaluation results true, it automatically updates the booking rate state to true. We will call this only when the user selects any flight, so the dependency would be selected flights here. Now that we have already successfully called rule evaluation for instant data decision, it's finally the time to take real-time action on that decision. If a flight is selected, call get adjusted price, and if no flight is selected, show the base price. Now update the code to display get adjusted price when flight gets selected. Flight is in high demand and user session is more than 2. Then show the new price. Let's log in as Aline Garcia. Select a flight and book a ticket. Open network, copy the flight ID from the properties section, click 3 dots of the flight booked signal. Select evaluate, paste flight ID. Here the result shows flight booked is equal to 4. This means this flight has been booked 4 times in the last 1 hour. Similarly, evaluate signal flight clicked. The result turns out to be 9. This means 9 times this flight has been clicked in the last 1 hour, which is around 40% booking rate. This means this flight is in high demand, so the rule booking rate should turn out to be true. Check this by clicking the 3 dots of the rule booking rate. Select evaluate, paste flight ID, and the result shows true. Let's evaluate the session rule for Aline Garcia. Open the network tab again, copy the user ID of Aline Garcia, click 3 dots, select evaluate, paste the user ID, the result is true, which means Aline Garcia has visited more than 2 times. This means if we select this flight for Aline Garcia, it will update and increase the flight price by 30%, as you can see here. Flight is in demand, but user session is not more than 2. Then so the base price. Let's log in as Anthony Hall. Select the same flight, open network tab and copy the user ID from the properties section. We have already checked that this flight is in high demand and the booking rate rule is true for this flight. Click the 3 dots of the signal session count. Select evaluate, paste user ID, hit evaluate. The result shows session count is true, but the user session should be more than 2. This means that the value of session rule would be false. This means if we click the same flight for Anthony, the price won't change. Flight is not in demand and user session is more than 2, then decrease the price. Let's select another flight, open the network again, copy the selected flight ID, which is flight 004. Evaluate signal flight book for this flight. Hit evaluate button. No update means this flight has not been clicked by any user in the last 1 hour. Similarly, evaluate signal flight click. The result shows it has been clicked 5 times in the last 1 hour. This means that flight is not in demand, and if we evaluate booking rate, it turns out to be false.